You did not imagine the pause. You told them something good had happened, and for half a second their face changed before the warmth arrived. Then came the smile, the congratulations, the affectionate question, and before they had even finished responding, you made the good things smaller. You mentioned what had gone wrong too. You gave credit to someone else. You added that it probably was not a big deal. You found some difficulty to place beside your happiness so that nobody had to sit too long in the fact that your life was expanding. You did it smoothly, the way a person does something they have practiced for years without ever calling it practice. You call this humility, but humility does not require you to reduce yourself around the same few people again and again, in the same way, at the same speed, while the rest of your life goes on at full size. Humility is a relationship with your own limits. This was a relationship with somebody else's discomfort. Something else has been happening. There are people who genuinely love you and still feel a small contraction when something in you becomes brighter, freer, more alive. They may never consciously think, "I envy you." In fact, they may believe the opposite about themselves, and they may be sincere. They may worry about you, correct you, warn you not to get carried away, make a joke just sharp enough to bring you back down, tell you they only want to protect you. And this is why the envy is so difficult to see, because it does not always arrive looking like hostility. Sometimes it arrives holding love in its hands. The most painful part is not that you sensed it. The painful part is what you learned to do next. You learned to help them hide it. You shortened the story, lowered your excitement, left out the achievement, added a problem, made yourself easier to love before anyone directly asked you to. That rehearsal is the actual injury, not the pause in their voice. The fact that you edit your own life before you walk into the room, and that the editing has become so smooth you no longer feel it as effort, only as ordinary preparation. Something is removed from you every time, and the removal has stopped registering as loss. And here is the part that is harder to look at. Eventually, they did not have to do anything at all. No pause was required, no yoke, no correction, no careful warning. You began shrinking before the reaction arrived. In the car, in the hallway, in the seconds before the door opened, the adaptation had learned to run without them. That is when it stopped being a response and became a personality. Your modesty, your sensitivity, your way of making other people comfortable, it stopped being something you did in a difficult room and became something you supposedly were, everywhere, permanently. But notice this carefully. You do not do this with everyone. There are people around whom good news leaves your mouth at full size. Your shoulders do not rise before you speak. The sentence is not rehearsed in the car. You do not decide in advance which detail to leave out or why the achievement was partly luck. Your body had already classified the relationship before your mind was willing to, which means this was never a failure of perception. You saw exactly what was happening. You simply understood, beneath conscious thought, that seeing it clearly would force you to confront something far harder than envy. A person can love you and still struggle with what your aliveness makes them feel about themselves. And for years, rather than allowing those two truths to exist together. You solved the contradiction by making yourself smaller. That was the bargain. They did not have to confront the feeling, and you did not have to question the love. Through a Jungian lens, this is where the shadow begins to enter the relationship, not as cruelty and not as betrayal. It enters through the part of a person that cannot be admitted, and it borrows the nearest acceptable form. And the nearest acceptable form inside a loving relationship is almost always concern. You are supposed to be good at reading people. That is the strange part. You spent your life interpreting emotional weather in rooms where nobody said anything directly. And with these particular people, that accuracy goes quiet. It does not go quiet by accident. Perception is not free, and what seeing clearly would cost you here was a relationship you were not willing to lose. So you built an explanation instead. They were tired. They were having a hard year. You are too sensitive about tone. Every one of those sentences was doing a job, and the job was never truth. The job was making sure the evening could keep going, and that the good thing could stay small enough to be survivable for everyone in the room. The projection runs in the opposite direction from the one people expect. You were not only placing your own material onto them, you were receiving what they could not hold in themselves, storing it quietly, and then filing it under your own excess, your own too much, your own tendency to overreact. Consider what they actually see when they look at you. Someone who is still moved by things, someone whose reactions have not been sanded down by disappointment, someone who cries at what they themselves stopped being able to cry at years ago, someone whose inner life is visibly, inconveniently, still running. That is not a small thing to witness when your own has gone quiet. Envy in its deeper form is rarely about money or appearance or achievement. It is aimed at aliveness, at the evidence that someone was not required to shut down in order to get through their life. That evidence is difficult to be near when your own shutting down was never a choice you remember making, only a thing that gradually finished. And here is what makes it invisible. The person feeling it usually does not know. It does not arrive in them as envy. It arrives as irritation, as correction, as a joke that lands slightly wrong, as unrequested advice, as concern about how much you feel and how openly you feel it. Concern is the perfect disguise. It looks like love from every angle, including from inside the person offering it. Nobody has to lie for this to work. That is why you could never catch it, and why you slowly began to distrust yourself for sensing anything at all. There is no confrontation available with a feeling nobody is having on purpose, which is why you stopped looking for one. Some of them praise you for it, which is the most confusing part. You are told you have a beautiful heart, and in the same conversation, you are told to be careful, that people will take advantage, that you should protect yourself more. The compliment and the warning arrive together, and only one of them is about you. You may have been given the word sensitive for this, or empath. The word matters less than what it describes. You are someone whose feelings stayed accessible inside a family, a marriage, or a working life where other people's did not. That was never a spiritual category. It was a survival that went in a different direction. You were praised early for understanding, for being the one who could tell what was wrong without being told. Somewhere along the way you noticed that your understanding made people comfortable, and your happiness did not always do the same. So you gave the first generously and rationed the second, and the rationing eventually stopped needing a decision. It became automatic, then invisible, then admirable. People described you as low maintenance, as easy, as someone who never makes anything about themselves, and you accepted it because it was the only compliment consistently available. You were right about the mechanics, even where you were wrong about the meaning. Your good news did unsettle them. Your ease did cost them something. You were not imagining the effect. You were entirely accurate about the effect and extraordinarily generous about the cause. That generosity is the most consistent feature of your life, and it has almost never been aimed at yourself. There is a reason this took so long to see. To name envy in another person, you must first admit that you have something they want, and that admission is not available to you. It sounds like arrogance in your own mouth before the thought has even finished forming. You would rather be wrong about a room full of people than say one true sentence about your own value out loud. So the recognition failed at the entry point, not because you were blind, and not because you lacked information, because seeing it required a sentence about yourself that you had never been allowed to say out loud. And a sentence you cannot say is a sentence you cannot think. So the perception arrived, found no language waiting, and dissolved back into a vague tiredness. What Jung called the shadow is not the evil inside a person. It is what the conscious identity could not permit itself to hold. For someone who spent years being reasonable, being contained, being fine, another person's open feeling can become unbearable without ever once becoming conscious. They do not think, "I envy you." They think, "You should be more careful." They think, "Not everyone can afford to live that openly." They believe they are protecting you, and the protective impulse is genuinely real. It is simply not aimed at you. It is aimed at something in themselves they have never met. And this is where it stops being simple. They do love you. That is not the cover story. That is the actual condition. The affection and the contraction live in the same person at the same time, in the same evening, and neither one cancels the other out or makes the other false. They will hold your hand at a funeral and go slightly quiet at your good news. And both of those are them. You have been asked to choose between those two facts for years. Either they love me or they resent me. You chose the first every time, because the second felt like an accusation you had no right to make against people who had also shown up for you, driven to see you, sat with you when something went wrong. So you paid for the peace yourself. You brought the smaller version. You led with the difficult parts of your week. You let the good thing come out sideways, mentioned late, half buried, as though it had happened to someone else. It was a quiet tax, paid by you, on a regular schedule, so that nobody else had to feel something they could not name. Nobody sent the bill. You calculated it yourself and paid it early. There is a specific tiredness that follows those visits, not the tiredness of conflict, something flatter than that. You leave, the car is quiet, and you cannot say what happened, because nothing happened. That is exactly the point. Nothing happened. all evening, on purpose, and you were the one making sure of it, which means some part of you always knew precisely who it was around. You had the information and filed it somewhere language could not reach, and then you called the silence loyalty, and the loyalty felt like love, and the love was real. What you called instinct was a decision, made repeatedly in increments so small that no single one of them looked like a decision. Nobody makes one large choice to disappear, and a choice made in increments does not feel like a choice. It feels like personality. It feels like being easygoing. It feels like being the kind of person who does not need much, which is a sentence you have said about yourself with something close to pride, usually while being tired. The complex does not ask permission before it repeats. It arranges a similar room again, with different people, until its logic becomes visible, which is why you may have found this same weather in a friendship, then a workplace, then a marriage, and concluded that it was simply what closeness costs. But it is not what closeness costs. It is what one particular arrangement costs. An arrangement that required your accuracy to stay switched off in the exact places where it worked best. Other people are close to each other without this. You have watched them do it and assumed they simply had easier families, and you have been paying it so quietly for so long that at some point you stopped calling it a cost and began calling it your character. That is the moment worth returning to, because everything that followed was built on top of it, and built well. Character is what a pattern becomes once it has run long enough to look like nature. But this one has architecture, and architecture can be traced. It did not stay inside the few relationships where it began. It moved outward, into work, into friendship, into which desires you permitted yourself to say out loud. Watch how good news leaves your mouth in a professional room. It arrives as a team effort. It arrives attached to luck, to timing, to someone else's earlier help. All of that may be true. Notice how fast it arrives, though the credit is redistributed before anyone has had the chance to feel anything about you having it. That speed is the tell. Generosity has a pace. This has none. This is a reflex trained by repetition, and reflexes are built by consequence. Something happened more than once when you let a good thing stand at full size in front of the wrong person, and you learned the shape of what followed without ever deciding to learn it. So the strategy refined itself. Stay slightly below the line where envy can attach. Be excellent in a way that helps other people rather than in a way that outranks them. Be the one who develops others. Be indispensable and unthreatening at once, which is a very specific and very expensive position to hold. That position has a name nobody says out loud. You became the person other people feel better after seeing. Not because you lifted them, because standing next to you cost them nothing. There is real warmth in that arrangement. And there is also a ceiling, and you built the ceiling yourself out of good manners, and it worked. That is the part usually left out of the story. It bought you something real. It bought you a place in rooms that would have quietly cooled if you had taken up the space your actual life deserved, and warmth in rooms that had no other way of offering it. You have probably called that being a team player, being humble, not caring about status. Look at what those words are covering. They are covering an accurate reading of the emotional economy around you and a decision to make yourself an unprofitable target inside it. You did not learn that from a book. You learned it the way people learn weather, by being caught out in it once and remembering. There is a further move, quieter and harder to admit. At some point, you began keeping one visible difficulty alive at all times. A problem you mention, a struggle that is genuinely yours, but that you have never quite let yourself finish solving, and never quite let yourself stop referring to. You can hear it in how you answer the question about how you are. There is always something ongoing. The knee, the sleep, the situation at work that has been almost resolved for 2 years. It is all true, and it all arrives first, and none of it has ever been allowed to finish. Envy does not attach to someone who is having a hard time. A person with a visible burden is safe. So the burden began serving two functions, and only one of them was real suffering, the other was insurance, and you never named it, because naming it would mean the struggle had a use. Your difficulties are yours, and they cost you something real. What deserves attention is why the difficult thing always makes it into the conversation. Unprompted, early, while the good thing has to be extracted from you with direct questions. Notice how you feel when someone asks you plainly what has been going well. There is a beat, a small search for something acceptable to hand over. The breath shortens slightly, as though you were preparing to defend a claim rather than answer an ordinary question from someone who is interested in you. In Jungian terms, what you built is a persona, and a persona is not a lie. It is the social form that made function and belonging possible. Yours was assembled around one particular requirement. Be the person whose presence does not make anyone measure themselves against you. Be pleasant to be near. Be a relief rather than a comparison. In every room, without needing to be asked twice. A persona becomes painful only when it stops being a form you wear and starts being the only shape available. And that is what happened. You did not put this on for difficult company and take it off afterward. It became the default setting, running quietly even in rooms where nobody required it of you. Then the choosing began, and this is where the structure reaches deepest. You did not only manage your existing relationships around this, you started selecting new ones by it, steadily, for years, without ever once experiencing yourself as selecting anything. It felt like chemistry. It felt like some people were simply easier to be around, and you never asked what they had in common. You gravitated toward people who needed something from you, not because you love rescue, though you may have told yourself that, because a person who needs you is a person who is not comparing themselves to you. Need points in one direction, envy points in another. You chose the direction that felt survivable, and you moved away, gently and with good reasons, from people who were doing well and had nothing to ask of you. Those relationships thinned out over a few years. You called it drifting. You called it different life stages. Something was steering, and it was steering by a rule you had never consciously read. Consider what this means about the closeness you actually built. Much of it rests on your usefulness being visible and your fullness being partly hidden, which is why so many of your relationships are warm and yet somehow one-directional, and why you have described yourself more than once as known by many and understood by very few. They are not withholding understanding from you. They are working with what you supplied. You gave them the interpreter, the steady one, the one with the manageable problem. You did not give them the person whose life is going well and who would like that fact to be witnessed by someone. Here is the reversal that lives underneath the others. You have grieved not being seen for years, and the arrangement you built was designed, in its central mechanism, to make you unseeable in precisely the way you were mourning. The loneliness and the strategy were never separate things. It is the logic of a bargain doing exactly what it promised. You traded visibility for safety, and the trade was honored in full. You have been safe. You have also been alone inside relationships that other people would describe sincerely, as close. Both halves of that were always going to arrive together. There was never a version where only one did. Money carries this too. If you look, notice the discomfort when you spend on something that is only for you, the instinct to justify it aloud before anyone comments, the impulse to buy something for the other person in the same transaction. Evening, a ledger that nobody has opened. The same rule governs rest. Rest that has been earned by exhaustion can be mentioned freely. Rest that is simply chosen cannot. One is a recovery from difficulty and reads as safe. The other is an unapologetic claim on your own life, and claims are the thing you learned earliest to disguise. And there is a version of this that reaches into your ambitions, into the things you might have made or attempted. Some of them you never dropped. You simply never let them grow large enough to be noticed by anyone whose reaction you could not survive. And so they stayed the size of a private intention. What Jung called the unlived life does not vanish because it was postponed. It waits. It returns as restlessness, as a low irritation with your own days, as the sense that something was set aside for reasons you can no longer reconstruct and would not be able to defend if asked. It rarely announces what it wants. It only makes the ordinary week feel slightly wrong. You may feel it most sharply when someone with far less capacity than you does the thing openly and badly and receives ordinary support for it. Something turns over in the chest, something closer to grief arriving with heat, and it disappears again before you can look at it directly. The complex does not ask permission before it repeats. It builds the same room in a new location, new colleagues, new friendships, another family gathering, and the same weather arrives. And each time it confirms what you already believed about closeness in general. The confirmation felt like wisdom. It was closer to a loop reporting on itself. Except the pattern was never about closeness in general. It was about a specific arrangement being carried from place to place, intact and undeclared, by the only person present who could ever have set it down. That is not a comfortable sentence, and it is also the first one in years that gives you somewhere to stand. That is the sentence with a cost inside it. If the arrangement travels with you, then the people who cannot tolerate your fullness are no longer the whole explanation. Something in you has been recruiting for the role quietly and finding candidates with remarkable efficiency, not because you wanted to be diminished, but because the arrangement knew how to keep itself supplied, and it had a great deal of practice. Do not turn that into an accusation against yourself. You did not do this out of weakness. You did it because there was a period in your life when being unthreatening was the price of remaining connected, and you paid it correctly, and it worked, and something in you has never been told that the period ended. The trouble is that the arrangement has no mechanism for noticing when the danger has passed. It cannot tell the difference between a person who genuinely contracts around your happiness and a person who would be glad for you if you ever let them. It treats every room as the original room, and every face as the face it first learned to read, so it applies the same tax everywhere. You bring the smaller version to the people who cannot bear the larger one, and you bring the smaller version to the people who have been waiting years to meet it. And both of them receive an edited life and reasonably conclude that it is you, which raises something you have been circling without landing on. If the editing is automatic, and if it runs equally with everyone, then you have never actually tested how many of your relationships require it. You have only tested how many of them tolerate the edited version, and tolerance was never the thing you were hoping for. You know what those particular few do with your good news. You do not know what the others would do, because none of them have ever been given anything to respond to. The evidence supporting your caution has never once included a case where you stopped being cautious. Every trial you ran was rigged before it started, and you were the one running it, and that is where the structure closes around itself. The arrangement protects you from a reaction it will never permit you to observe, and the absence of evidence has been serving all this time, quietly and convincingly, as proof. Nothing bad happens, nothing much happens at all. That has been the whole design. Proof is a strong word for what you have. What you have is a long silence you agreed to call an answer, and silences of that length develop a cost that does not announce itself, because it is subtracted from you rather than done to you, and subtraction leaves no bruise to point at. Start with the most ordinary form of it. Somewhere in the last few years, something good happened to you and you did not tell anyone. Not out of secrecy. There was simply no one in the mental list who could receive it without the news needing adjustment first. So it stayed where it was and quietly stopped feeling real. That is what an unwitnessed life does. It does not hurt in the moment. It thins. Experiences that no one has confirmed begin to feel like things you may have exaggerated, and after enough of them, you develop a faint doubt about your own life while it is still happening to you. You start remembering your own years the way you would remember someone else's. Then comes the part that is harder to say. You begin to suspect your own perception in general. If you cannot trust yourself about the pause in their voice, you cannot fully trust yourself about anything relational. And that uncertainty does not agree to stay inside one compartment. So you started asking other people whether you were overthinking it. You outsourced the verdict on your own accurate readings to people who had not been in the room, and often they told you that you were being sensitive, and you felt relieved, because relief was cheaper than the alternative and arrived much faster. Notice what happens now when someone says they are happy for you. There is a fraction of a second of scanning. You check the face before you accept the sentence. You have become unable to receive plain gladness at full value from anyone, including the people who mean it entirely and always have. That is the deepest cost so far. Not that some people could not celebrate you. That celebration itself has become a thing you inspect rather than take in. The good was contaminated by the accurate detection of the bad, and the accuracy that was meant to protect you has quietly begun taxing everything. And here the tenderness has to hold, because what comes next is not an accusation. It is the shadow material this whole arrangement has been carrying on your behalf, and it belongs to you, and it is not a defect in you. It is simply the part of the story you have never been able to tell from your own side without flinching. You have been envied. You have also envied, not in the same rooms, and not toward the same people. But the machinery is not foreign to you. You know the small drop when a peer announces something you had wanted. You know how quickly the congratulation arrives afterward, and how convincing it sounds. You know it because you have covered it too. You have felt the contraction and produced the warmth on top of it within a second. And the person receiving your warmth had no idea that anything had preceded it. You are not standing on the outside of this. You are fluent in it, and fluency is not the same as guilt, though it will try to arrive dressed as guilt, which means when you say they hide it behind love, you are describing an operation you have personally performed. It makes you someone who understands the mechanism from the inside, which is precisely why you could detect it in others so reliably and so early. But there is a second layer, and it is less comfortable. If you know how convincingly the cover works, then part of you has always known that some of the affection you offer people is also covering something, and you have needed their affection to be pure in order to keep believing that yours was now something else. Consider what you have received from being the one who is envied rather than the one who is envying. There is a position inside that story, and it is not a powerless one, and you have been occupying it for a very long time without ever putting a name to what it gave you. You are the one who feels. You are the one who did not shut down. You are the one whose inner life stayed alive while theirs went quiet. That is a real distinction, and it is also a rank, and you have been holding the rank for years without ever calling it one. It sat underneath the modesty, undisturbed, protected by the very smallness that seemed to contradict it. Every time you smoothed the moment over, you were not only protecting the relationship, you were confirming your own position inside it, the generous one, the one who understands, who absorbs, who does not make a scene. Their contraction kept proving something reassuring about your character. That is the reversal that costs the most. The arrangement was not only a tax you paid, it was also a currency you collected. And the currency was moral standing. And moral standing is one of the few things a person can accumulate for decades without ever admitting to wanting it. You were paid every time you did not complain, and the payment arrived as self-respect. Look at what that made unnecessary. If you are the one who understands, you never have to ask for anything directly. If you are the one absorbing, you never have to test whether anyone would show up for you. The role removed the risk of asking, and asking was always the more dangerous act. So the smaller version was not purely a sacrifice, it was also a way of never finding out. Never finding out who would have been glad, never finding out who would have stayed, never finding out whether the closeness you already had could hold a person at full size, including you. Something in the chest goes still around that sentence. Not pain exactly, the stillness of a defense noticing that it has been described accurately, and having nowhere immediate to go, and no argument prepared that would not sound like the arrangement speaking on its own behalf. The chest answers before the sentence forms. You may want to argue with it anyway, to say the danger was real, the reactions were real, the people did contract, all of that is true, both things are true at once, and the arrangement survived for so long precisely because the true part made the useful part impossible to see. Every good defense is built on something real. That is what makes it a defense and not a delusion. There is grief here that has been waiting a long time, not for the people who could not celebrate you, for the years of good things that arrived and were made small in transit by you before anyone else had the chance to touch them or fail to. Birthdays, promotions, ordinary Tuesdays where something quietly went right. Nobody took those from you. That is what makes the grief so difficult to place. There is no one to be angry with, no scene to point to, only a long accumulation of moments where the full version of a thing existed for a few seconds inside you and was quietly reduced before it reached the air. And you cannot be angry at the person who did the reducing, because they were doing it to keep you connected, and they were very young when they learned how, and they were entirely right about the room they were standing in at the time. The strategy was correct. It simply never received notice that the room had changed. What Jung called the shadow is not the worst of a person. It is what the conscious identity could not permit. Yours could not permit wanting recognition, wanting to be celebrated, wanting someone to be plainly glad for you without your having earned it first through visible difficulty. So the wanting went underground and returned in a form you could accept. It came back as sensitivity to other people's envy, which is a way of thinking about admiration constantly, while never once having to admit that you would like some of it directed at you. The subject stayed in the room, only your claim on it left. It is what a forbidden need does when it still has to get air. It disguises itself as an observation about other people, and the observation is usually correct, which is exactly what makes the disguise so durable and so difficult to dismantle. A false thing can be argued with. A true thing doing a second job cannot, until the second job is named. None of this cancels what you saw. The pause was there. The warning inside the compliment was there. Your reading was accurate, and your reading was also serving something. And both facts can stand in the same room without either one collapsing the other. You were not paranoid. You were also not only observing. Both of those can be carried at once. That is the hardest posture to hold, and it is the one everything has been moving toward, not deciding whether they love you or envy you, learning to remain present while both are true, in the same person, on the same evening, without needing the question settled before you are willing to stay, because the settling was always the problem. You could not tolerate the mixture, so you resolved it in their favor and paid the difference yourself. Every time, in installments small enough that no single one of them ever registered as a loss, and an unregistered loss cannot be grieved. So it simply accumulates, and you cannot go back to that resolution now, not because you have decided anything, because the mechanism has been seen working, and a mechanism that has been watched does not run the same way again, even when nothing has yet arrived to take its place. There will be an interval. The interval is not a failure. It is what the space feels like before it has a shape. Nothing has replaced it yet, and the first thing you notice is how ordinary the change looks from outside. You tell someone a good thing, and you do not add the problem afterward. The sentence ends where it actually ends. There is a small silence while you resist filling it, and your hand moves toward your cup for no reason. They may not even notice. That is the strange part. What feels enormous inside you registers as almost nothing in the room. A slightly longer pause. A sentence that stayed whole. Nobody comments. Because from the outside, there is nothing visible to comment on. And the largest changes in an adult life are almost always this quiet. But sometimes it is noticed, and then the language arrives. You seem different lately. You used to be easier to talk to. You have gotten confident, said in a tone that is not quite a compliment. Something has changed with you, and it is said as a question that is not really a question. You will be tempted to explain. That is the oldest reflex you have. The instinct is to reassure them that nothing has changed, that you are still the same, that they have not lost anything, and to say it quickly enough that the discomfort never has a chance to fully form in the room. Notice the shoulders when that impulse rises. Notice the sentence already assembling itself before you have decided whether it is true. This is the moment where the arrangement asks to be restored, and it asks politely, and it disguises itself as kindness toward someone who seems confused. What they are responding to is usually not confidence. It is the withdrawal of a service. For years, your presence contained a small ongoing reassurance that they were not being measured, and that reassurance has stopped arriving without either of you ever having named what it was. Some of them will grieve it, not maliciously. They will feel a loss they cannot describe, and they will attach it to you having changed, because the alternative is recognizing what they had been receiving from you all along and never once had to ask for. Grief without language usually comes out as complaint, and a few will simply be glad. This is the part your caution was never able to predict. Someone will hear the whole sentence, at full size, with nothing appended to it, and their face will do exactly what it appears to be doing. No pause, no adjustment, just gladness, arriving plainly. You will scan it anyway. That habit does not stop because you understood it. You will check the face, find nothing there, and then have to sit with the more difficult work of accepting something you had spent most of your adult life being unable to receive. The scanning will keep running for a while after it has stopped being necessary. That is the actual difficulty ahead, and it is not the one you expected, not the people who contract, the people who do not, and the exposure of being witnessed by them at full size, with the editing switched off and nothing standing between you and their attention. Being unwanted was familiar. Being welcomed without adjustment is not. There is no verdict to reach about the others. That is what has changed. And it is smaller than transformation and considerably more useful. You do not have to decide whether the person across the table loves you or resents you. You can stop requiring the answer before you are willing to be in the room with them. They may do both. The warmth in their voice can be entirely real, and the small contraction underneath it can be real at the same moment, and neither one has to be resolved for you to stay through the afternoon, eat a meal, and mean most of the conversation while noticing the rest. What changes is what you do with the contraction when you feel it. You used to absorb it and pay for it by making yourself smaller. Now you can register it, understand what it is, and let it belong to the person it came from, which is where it always belonged and where you were never able to leave it. That is not coldness. It is closer to accuracy. You are no longer taking a feeling that arose inside another person and treating it as an invoice addressed to you, due immediately, payable in the only currency you had. It is still their feeling. It was always going to be theirs to meet or not meet. Something loosens in the jaw when that distinction lands, and it usually lands afterward. In the car, in the quiet, where you notice that you are not doing the familiar review of what you said and how it might have looked, and whether anyone found it too much. The review used to run the entire drive home. Now it starts, finds nothing to work with, and stops. The relationships will reorganize on their own. Some will not survive the removal of the tax, and that will be sad and clarifying at the same time. Others will get quietly better without either person understanding why, because there is more of you inside them now, and more of you is not a threat to everyone. You may find yourself telling someone something good, unprompted, in the middle of an ordinary week, for no reason other than that it happened and you wanted them to know it. This will feel slightly reckless while you are doing it. It is not. It is what people who were never taxed have been doing casually, all their lives, without noticing it was allowed. You may find that you no longer need one visible difficulty on hand at all times. The struggles remain what they are, but they stop having a second job. That frees something you cannot name yet, and the freeing shows up first as a strange amount of unclaimed attention with nowhere to go. You will still catch yourself editing, weeks from now, months from now. A good thing will come out already shrunk, and you will hear it happen while it is happening. That is not failure. That is the difference between an unconscious arrangement and one you can now watch running. Seeing it happen while it happens is not the same as being governed by it, though for a while the two will feel almost identical, and you will still love the ones who cannot bear your fullness. That does not resolve either. You will love them and see them at the same time, which is more work than either loving them blindly or leaving them entirely. And it is the only version that includes both of you as real people. There is grief that comes with this, and it does not clear quickly. Grief for the years, for the good news that stayed inside, for how many rooms you entered already reduced. It arrives at odd hours, without heat, and it asks for nothing except to be acknowledged and allowed to sit down. Let it be there. It is not a sign that something went wrong today. It is what accumulates when a person has been generous in a way that cost far more than anyone knew, including the people who benefited most, including you. Grief arriving late is still grief arriving on time. What Jung understood about the persona is that it does not have to be destroyed. It has to stop being mistaken for the whole person. Your capacity to read a room, to soften an edge, to know what someone can hold, remains genuinely yours. It simply no longer has to run without your consent. In every room, for everyone, you will still walk into the visits. You will still hear the pause. What is different is small enough that no one is going to announce it. You will feel the contraction and let it belong to the person it came from, and stay through the afternoon anyway, and drive home without the flat tiredness that used to follow. The warmth was always real. The contraction was always real. What has changed is that neither of them has to be decided before you can sit down. Nothing was resolved. You simply stopped paying the difference.